noticed the rain outside this morning. Okay. It actually reminds me of a favorite saying of one of my younger brothers. He lives in Colorado, and he says, and I don't know if this is his or he's quoted somebody I couldn't find anywhere to attribute it, but he says, "Rain is just snow that has not lived up to its full potential." Again, he lives in Colorado. They're used to sometimes hundreds of inches. So as we got wet and cold today, I was thinking about that, and I started thinking about all of the times in my life that snow has appeared. Every time from when I was really young to where it seemed like my boots would be almost covered as I would try to walk out in probably just a couple inches of snow. But then there's those years that we lived just above Chicago, where I can remember coming home from Christmas one time to find a 6.5, 7 foot snowdrift that was on the driveway right beside the swing set, which was really impressive to someone who was still in elementary school. Then it was March of 1993. I don't know if we got it here in Columbia. You did too? I had come home to Piedmont from Duke and got stuck there for a while because I couldn't get back up to Durham in, it was 7 or 10 inches. But then it was February of 2010. I had been invited by a couple who were friends of mine to do a baptism at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And it was going to be over kind of Valentine's Day weekend. But February of that year, they termed that Snowmageddon up there. They got between 1 and 2+ feet of snow, in Washington, D.C., which was supposed to be part of our trek, was shut down. I mean, there was nothing open. And so we ended up going up there, and with the kids, we allowed them to sled with some of the college students at UVA and coming back down. But I do recognize that snow is not something that we see a lot. I was like, okay, God, come on, set me up. Let it, just a few flakes. But I was looking and I was like, nope, 40s is just not going to happen this morning. But probably my favorite kind of snowfall is that in the day when it's light and peaceful and it's coming down and there's this blanket of quiet and peace where everything, even here in the South, it's not for long, but it just everything pauses for a minute where you can just kind of take a breath. And that cool blanket of the powdery stuff, there's a place in my heart that I just get excited. And when I'm about as enraptured with snow as I think I could possibly be, I start looking at the work of a man named Wilson Alwyn Bentley. Are any of you familiar with him? None of you would know him, but might be familiar with his work. He was from Vermont and was fascinated by snow, which is a good thing if you're from Vermont to be fascinated by it. But see, he was born at the end of the Civil War, so 1865. And he died before most of us were born in 1931, so in the early years of the Depression. And he was so enamored by snow that he used one of the newest forms of technology to examine it, to explore it, to investigate it. Do you know what that technology was? The camera. He was the first person, actually, he found a way to capture the snow on a black velvet and then take pictures. I mean, you're talking at the turn of the 20th century and a little before. He was taking pictures in the 1800s of snow. And he photographed and published more than 5,000 individual snowflakes, and you can actually see his work at the Buffalo Museum of Science up in New York. And his obsession caused him to have a nickname. Any guesses what people called him? They called him Snowflake. I know. But he loved to put them under a microscope and to examine them, and he found that their patterns were amazing. And he said each one were miracles of beauty. I'll quote him. He said, "Every crystal was a masterpiece of design, and no one design was ever repeated." And then he wrote, "When a snowflake melted, that design was forever lost. Just that much beauty was gone without leaving any record behind." Now, I know that, Bentley, I don't think minded being called Snowflake, but I don't think that a lot of people like being called snowflakes anymore. Oh, thank you. I appreciate your chuckle. It's because snowflake today just means someone who's not able to stand even the slightest bit of heat. But we actually do have a lot in common with the snowflake. We are miracles of beauty, masterpieces of design, and no one design is ever really repeated. Even with twins, there are significant differences, and we are shaped in our uniqueness by a loving Creator whose imagination is limitless. We are God's snowflakes. Every single one of us precious, unique, and temporary. One of the things that I notice as we grow older, we begin to realize just how fleeting and fragile and precious life is. We want to try to capture that moment, to preserve it, because we know that otherwise it's just we're lost and we disappear forever. So we need someone who can be a stronghold for us, someone to preserve us. The good news is that our God is the Lord of the snowflakes. Psalm 27 starts at a place of recognizing in the world where the fear is and saying, looking at one place and looking at another, the Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? Of whom shall I be afraid when the Lord is my stronghold of my life? But recognize that even in the psalm, there's already a looking around. It's as if there's a recognition that in life there are things which cause people to be afraid, which create fear and anxiety in us. And, that analogy of being a snowflake doesn't seem like it's reaching that far. Today, don't we feel kind of fragile in a lot of ways? I mean, the last couple of years with COVID, and then this season with COVID plus flu and RSV and other illnesses, it's a constant reminder that we are vulnerable to physical illnesses, isn't it? And beyond the physical, we face emotional hardships and anxieties, relational breakdowns, economic stresses. If you've been watching the news of all the things that are going on, it's not just individual, but it's as a community, and spiritual crises, and not only in individuals, but again in whole denominations. It at times feels like we are fragile and delicate as snowflakes, which can cause us to be afraid, can make us be anxious. But what if instead of choosing anxiety and fear, if we intentionally chose faith? What if we chose to trust in the one who has always been here, who will always be here, as a stronghold, as a place of shelter, and a sanctuary in our lives? Psalm 27 says that God will hide us in his shelter on the day of trouble. Notice it's not if trouble comes, but when trouble comes. God will hide us in his shelter, conceal us under the cover of his tent. In the days, or the early days of David, if he is the one that wrote this, it would have been before the temple, so the tabernacle would have been very familiar, worshiping God in this tent, this sanctuary, drawing near to God's presence. He will set me high upon a rock. God offering protection and deliverance when we trust in him, keeping us safe from anything that will destroy us. To remind us of this, what the psalm says we need to do in verse 8 is to seek God's face. You know what it is to seek God's face? When do we set aside time to go and to look for God, to be open to God's face appearing and speaking and celebrating who God is? Well, it's what we do in worship, is it not? As we gather together in God's name, it's seeking God's face is primary to who we are. In fact, it's one of the reasons that on the front of your bulletin, you'll notice it's part of our mission. The first part is we come and worship. It's who we are created to be. We come to be in the presence of God because we need to be reminded not only of God's love and grace, which we do need to be reminded of that, but we also need to be reminded of God's strong protection and presence. We rely on the comfort of God's Spirit to carry us through difficult days and the warmth of God's arm to wrap around us when this world is cold and harsh. We look for the light of God to shine in the darkness, which is why, in part, we use candles to represent God's presence that is here with us as we are seeking God's face, and that then goes before us into the world, reminding us that God is not in this one place, but actually meets us along the way to be a light and a salvation everywhere that we go. It's why one of the benedictions that we use in the church, we are asking that God's face shine upon us and be gracious to us, so that in the midst of the darkness, we can see the light and the hope that comes from God. Because challenges are not, it's not a matter of if challenges will come, but when will the next one come? And we know that in the midst of those, that God's deliverance means that we will not be destroyed by adversity. We will not melt and disappear forever like a snowflake lost in the sun. But there's a problem with faith, and I was trying to think of a great way to illustrate the problem of faith. And one example that I thought of, it's something that I had to do while I was at Furman. Well, I didn't have to. I took a class called World Military History, which was taught in part by the ROTC department. Now, as you can look at me, I'm not a military guy. I have a younger brother, the guy with the rain and snow not living up to his potential. Now, he was an Army guy. Got a nephew who is an Air Force guy, but me, it was interesting to study the history, and then there were these activities we got to do. I enjoyed the orienteering, where they gave you a coordinate and a compass and said, go find the flag that's planted out in the middle of nowhere in the forest, and that was fun. There was an obstacle course that we got to run. It was not anywhere near as stringent as what they make soldiers run in boot camp. But then the one that was the real one was we got to rappel off the top of the Physical Activity Center at Furman. Okay? It's like 40 feet plus up. And there's a ledge, and it's straight down. And you go up there, and it's just like with rock climbing. You get a harness strapped around you. It's around your thighs. It's around your hips. It's snug. You got a rope that you know is anchored to the top. They put little gadgets to be able to hold the rope, and you know that if you just put the rope behind you, that you'll stop. And if you can't, you've got somebody at the bottom that's got the other end of the rope. But the hardest part is not putting on the harness, and it's not the descent. The hardest part is the first two steps. Because what you're supposed to do is you stand with your back to the ground and your feet, as in the ground 40 feet down, and your feet looking at solid, and you're supposed to lean straight back. Not a little bit. If you just go a little bit and trust your toes, you're going to hit the wall and you're going to get hurt. What you have to do is you have to lean straight. And I can't do it now. I'll fall because I don't have that support. You have to trust in the people that tied the knots and the people that put on the harness, the person that's on the ground and on that rope, and you have to lean back with all of your weight. And that's the hardest part. The same is true with us and God. We can't just lean back part way and try to keep ourselves safe and close. We have to, at the edge, lean back with all of our weight and trust that God is our stronghold, that God is our salvation. Now, we know that God's promise of protection and deliverance doesn't shield us from suffering and pain. We may get hurt. We will get hurt. But it does mean that the Holy Spirit is with us to guide us through life's most difficult times so that we can emerge with unexpected healing and strength. And we can say, now my head is lifted up above me, above my enemies all around me, and I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Notice in the psalm, the enemies are all around. It's not that trouble isn't there. It's that God is lifting me up in the midst of trouble, and I can sing a song of praise to God because of who God is and what God is doing right now. because every single one of us is going to feel like a snowflake from time to time, blown around by the wind and in danger of melting with a passing breath. But when storms hit us, as it did the first disciples, and when they were gathered out in a boat and the waves were spilling over the edge and Jesus was sound asleep there in the boat with them, and they cried out in fear, he spoke and he calmed the waters, and he looked at them and said, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" He was reminding them, I'm here with you in the storm, in the boat. When illness strikes us, as it struck the people of Galilee, we're going to feel weakened and discouraged. But when we reach out to Christ, when we reach out to Jesus, we can find unexpected wholeness. And Jesus can say to us, as he said to them, your faith has made you well. Death is going to threaten. Every day it draws nearer, just as it threatened the daughter of a man named Jairus. And Jesus can come to us and say, do not fear, only believe. We are going to face enormous challenges, things that we don't comprehend how on earth we can see through or around or over it. Like the disciples, when they were faced with 5,000 hungry people and they could not imagine what needed to be done. And Jesus tells them, you give them something to eat. You know, if we can choose faith over fear, all can eat and be filled. Not because we've got this, but because God does. We need to learn to lean back all the way and trust God instead of relying on ourselves. Now, I recognize that it is not likely, and I looked, and like I said, I was hoping for some flakes today. I know that it's not likely we're going to get snow in Columbia, okay? But I did have, if you're here this morning, I had the ushers distribute some snowflakes to you, right? This is the closest I could get. I'm sorry. If you really want to imagine snow, you can throw it up in the air and it will float to the ground. But I want you to take these home. You can make them unique. You can cut them. You can draw on them. Make them your own. Put maybe Psalm 27 as a verse of reminder that God is your strength and your shield. Let it be a reminder that every single one of us, like every snowflake, is unique, is different, and God has created that way, and God knows better than anyone exactly how different and how unique each one of us are. But the beauty is that while every single one of us may be different, we can all choose the same response. When opportunities for anxiety arise, when opportunities for fear come face to face with us, we can choose faith. We can all choose to lean back, to trust in the one who has always been there and who always will be, to lean on Christ for our strength, knowing that God will take care of us. I pray that this day we will hear the summons of God who calls our name and who calls us to faith. Amen.
Save that thou art, thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. I need not, nor man's empty praise. Thou my presence now and always, thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won, may I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of
All praise to the name of the Father of light, one who listens and hears when I call. Every step he ordains, I shall walk without fear. In his light I'll not stumble or fall. In his light I'll not stumble or fall. What can mortal man do while I'm safe in his hand? He is God, on his word I rely. In the midst of my fear, I will trust in his name, for I know he will hear when I cry.
He knows all of my feelings, the depths of despair, all the limits my soul can endure. I will trust in his name, I have nothing to lose, for in him all my hopes are secure. Praise to the name of the Father of light, one who listens and hears when I call. Every step he ordains, I shall walk without fear. In his light I'll not stumble or fall. In his light I'll not stumble or fall.
God alone can deliver a soul from its death, lift a life from a wasteland of need. God alone can replenish with the blessings untold, until into his light we are freed. We are freed.
To the name of
Every step he ordains, I shall walk without fear. In his light I'll not stumble or fall.